what is the point of like a local church or something? Some people want to keep it restricted merely to the religious order of service. Other churches expand into all sorts of activities that are going beyond what happens on a Sunday morning, and I think that you could probably go too far in either of those directions.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromous. This is Byrne Power coming to you from the night in Tbilisi, Georgia. And today we're going to have another one of our Anadromous dialogues with a repeat visitor, Michael Sartori from Texas. And we had quite an interesting discussion about the kind of the practical side of this moment, which is extremely important in a time when we are being tempted, all of us, to live without practicality, without thinking about how things are made, how things are constructed. And Michael has, shall we say, a burden for this subject. And he has, I'm going to let him explain what he's doing right now and why he wanted to get together and talk. Meanwhile, let's see. Have you pressed like yet? Somebody else needs to find this besides you. Have you subscribed? Somebody needs to. Have you contributed to the channel? There is a link below. And are you thinking about coming to Georgia? An announcement will be forthcoming about what's happening with a gathering in Georgia, and things are happening. So, without any further ado, let's talk with Michael.
Okay, so in starting this project that I've been working on, Tectonic School, this kind of trade-centered idea, I've been looking at different sorts of communities and what's worked and what's not worked. And I've found over the years many times that whenever somebody seems to be presenting truth in a very well-balanced way that really cuts to the core of what matters most, there's been some connection there to L'Abri or to the teachings of Francis Schaeffer. And you spent some time there and got to know him a little bit, and more so even with the community. Mm-hmm. So, and you also had some experience in less well-balanced Christian communities, from what I remember on. So, what do you think was, what did they have that was unique? What pitfalls did they avoid, and what made it work?
Right, that's a really good question, and I've thought about it a lot. I've compared. I was on these Jesus People communes, which later mutated into a church, not the one commune, but a collection of them in this one area that were part of one ministry. And I spent, I'd say about 11 months as a student at L'Abri in two different chalets. One was called French L'Abri. It was in a small town above the city of Evian, where the Evian water comes from. And the other was in Switzerland across the lake. And I also wasn't able to stay on as a student because of the way things were done. This was 1978, 1979. But I did stay in the area, like I say, for about 11 months and kept in close contact with L'Abri and took part in many different L'Abri events and institutions, like the formal meals they had and such like that. And then after that, I was part of a thing called the New York Arts Group in New York City. And that was interesting to observe because it was completely different. And it was more professional artists who got together. But it was a community, but not the kind of community that, say, L'Abri was or these communes were. Then I was in Alaska, and I was part of a Presbyterian church there. And I visited quite a few different types of services. And even in Alaska, there were people who certainly had nothing to do with Christianity, who had kind of a zone of fellowship, you might say, within their own. There was like a whole area we called Mud Bay. And we used to talk about the Mud Bay people had a certain way of living, which changed by the time I left. It was one way at the beginning, and by the end, it seems to have mutated. So, yeah, I've had plenty of observations about people trying, I would say mostly, to live together or be part of a community or live in community. People express this in many different ways. And plus just actually doing a lot of reading on the subject as well. And when there were Jesus people communes, there were also, of course, many hippie communes, and we tried not to be like them. So that's where I would start. That's my experience.
I think the idea of, obviously, some sort of community is essential for everybody. People don't, except for the rare person, who is built to actually live as a hermit. We all need to connect with others, and as Christians, church tends to be at least the starting point for where that kind of community is going to build. But there's also a lot of that, that even to say, like, what is the point of like a local church or something? Some people want to keep it restricted merely to the, religious order of service. Other churches expand into all sorts of activities that are going beyond what happens on a Sunday morning, and I think that you could probably go too far in either of those directions. But but then something like L'Abri is not necessarily. It did not have a local church that was the center there. It was outside of a church community.
No,
right?
No, they actually did have a church.
Okay.
And they still have a Bible study on Sundays, which no one is required to go to. But they set up a variant on the Presbyterian church, and Schaefer was always a pastor. However, they kept the church as a very separate thing from L'Abri.
Okay.
And even though you would see the same people as some of the lectures, giving sermons and such, it was not, there were people who are part of the church who were not part of L'Abri, and people who are part of L'Abri who are not part of the church. And that was an important thing. And one of the things I've noticed, and this is definitely a principle that I learned at L'Abri, and where we went wrong in the Jesus people was by having everyone live together, that is, say, under one roof. And the problem with that is, well, first of all, when you have, for instance, two families, once you start with couples and then families, if you put them under one roof together, well, somebody's got to make the rules. Somebody's got to set the rules. And two families are like two separate
nations.
world. Yeah. And so you can do it for a while, a year, maybe two, but after a while, the tensions are going to show up. So that was one thing. We often had too many people living together under one roof. And the answer to that is to have more than one roof. And when I first went to L'Abri, and in fact, I'm going to get Ellis Potter to talk about this, because he was there when I first got there in 1978, when L'Abri was a series of chalets that people stayed in. And then there was a central chapel, which was also a library, and it wasn't located in one place. Later, it went through a difficult period in the 1980s. And out of that, and this really pertains to Ellis, his wife, whom he met at L'Abri, was running a therapy center for people with cerebral palsy. She decided, for some reason, which I have to ask him about exactly why, to stop doing it. But what she did was she gave this huge chalet to L'Abri. So what ended up happening is some of the smaller chalets were still occupied by L'Abri people, and they would host dinners, and they would have their own families. So the families were in one place, and eventually the majority of the students were all in this one building with one, usually single, but not always, sometimes a family of workers living in the very, very top. I mean, it was a huge, massive, like 4 or 5 story chalet. Wow. And that worked out pretty well, and that is still the way it functions. But I want to ask him about that period of transition and his reflections on the difference and the benefits and the pros and cons of the two ways of being, one having no specific axis and the other having very specific axis. There is a book that was put out by a photographer, a Christian named Sylvester Jacobs. Sorry if I cough, it's because I'm still getting over
no worries.
Cold. But Sylvester Jacobs made this photo book called Portrait of a Shelter, which is a great record of L'Abri in the 1970s, a couple of years before I got there. But for me, it looks like my yearbook, except, of course, it's not formatted like a yearbook. It's formatted like a book of very good photos. But one thing this book makes a point of is that there are two communities there. And I'm not talking the church and the L'Abri itself as an institution, but that is to say there was a village, and then there's L'Abri inside of it. And so one of the things that L'Abri has to do is to live within the village. And so when I first got there, some of the first things I did to work and help out L'Abri was, I remember the very first job I was given in 1978 in October was to go over to this older woman's house, pull out her carpet, take it out into the fresh snow, turn it upside down onto the snow, and then beat the whole thing so that the dust all went into the snow, and then take it out, and it was nice and clean. I said, oh, I never knew you could do that. And then lay it back out for her and move the furniture back over it. And that was something we did for the village, the community. And I think that the connection between the geography, the place that's already there, and any sort of what people now call them intentional communities. I'm not sure if I like that phrase that much, but any sort of a community that's built on top of that has to interact. It can't be a separate community, because that's where things start getting in trouble. And in California, I think we were a bit too separate from the world around us, which is what led us into troubles. We had connections with the other churches, but for one thing, the place, the city we were in, 20, 30,000 people, much bigger than a small Swiss village. And and in Alaska, what's interesting is, to me, I lived in the town of Haines and the Chilkat Valley, and this whole area had I think at most, during the time I lived there, about 2,500 people. The city probably had something like 1,500 people, but there are also these other areas. But it still functioned as a community of sorts. And that is to say, if I went away to go study, puppetry in Europe for 3 months and came back, the people at the post office would say, "Well, how was your trip, Byrne?"
Mm-hmm.
You know, and to me, one of the things that we often miss in our discussion of community is that a community can't be all of one kind of person. It has to be a variety of people who have different jobs. And even in the Bible, when it discusses what a church is, how is it then that you all have different gifts? And so one person sings, one person talks or teaches, someone else ministers to people. That, to me, in the Christian sense, is a community, but also in the larger sense, a community is made up of different people. They're not all the one kind of person, which is why I have a great deal of difficulty even calling universities communities, because they tend to be all of one kind of person, or calling internet communities, because again, they tend to be people with an interest all in common. But I'm not so sure that makes up a community. I think you need I was really glad I started giving classes there on the history of music, and I remember there was this one 80-year-old man who used to come to the classes. Now, I was playing rap music and death metal and all sorts of stuff, but he would walk up to me afterwards and say, "Byrne, I don't know how you know all these things. You just have all of this knowledge." And I said, "Tom," he's long since passed. I said, "Tom, you can take apart a plane and put it back together again, can't you?" And he goes, "Yeah." "And you can take apart a boat and put it back together again." And he goes, "Yeah." "And you can take apart a car or a truck." And he goes, "Yeah, yeah." I said, "Well, you spent your time learning that. I spent my time doing this. I think what you've done is much more of there's much more to it than what I do. I mean, I'm just giving information. You're actually entering the stuff of the world and repairing it and fixing it and in some case reinventing it."
Mm.
So,
well, and that story really touches on one of the things that I've noticed and I think is important. One of the reasons why I'm doing this project is because I think there probably is in any given local church a handful of men who do have an incredible wisdom and knowledge. So, and it could be of a variety of things. I'm kind of setting, I kind of said I'm going to start this focused on like building trades, which could be basic things, or it could be more specialized in the future. But really, it's to say, when people do these things for a long time, they tend to forget. I guess because you just get competent at it, it's not difficult for you anymore. You don't see the value in what you know, but we need to find people and say, no, what you know how to do is very important. Other people aren't learning that the same way, and kind of get them, to share. So, I mean, I want to see it even as a necessary, part of it is that there's a big problem with young men don't really have a direction, but also these older men, we have not utilized their talents and their gifts to the fullest potential. So, I guess, I think some of the spirit of L'Abri, I would say, is that I noticed that there is an appreciation for those kind of things,
the way the whole thing was organized, and still is, although I'm sure it's been applied differently throughout the years, is that you work half a day and you study half a day. And the work you do is always for cleaning, repairing things, someone else may be uploading videos or, recording something. That there's a variety of different kinds of work. But then your study is more of a personal time, and you have a tutor that you interact with, I think, once a week. And you say, well, this is what I've been reading and such. So that L'Abri was always emphasized the whole person.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think one of the problems I know I faced in my Christian environment in the Jesus people and beyond was that the spiritual stuff all had to do with singing, preaching, being a missionary, all of that sort of stuff. And common everyday work was in another category.
Yeah.
And even before I left them, I realized that has to be wrong. That it's not, what we do is not simply about following the 10 Commandments. The worker has to be skilled in their work according to the words of the Bible. They have to be honest in their work. In other words, the principles have to filter down to everyone. And so it doesn't do any good to say, oh, this person's a great person, comes to church, sits there, sings the songs, reads the Bible, and then everybody knows not to buy insurance from this person.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a problem there. So to me, as a Christian, but I would say that this can be applied in other ways. You have to be what you say you are. You have to have a direct, as much as possible. We all have areas of hypocrisy and incompetence and things like that. But to the degree we can, we have to be who we say we are, and that includes in our work. Work is not a separate part of life. So,
yeah. So, I would say, and I have a doc. If anybody wants to read it, I have a document. It's on a Discord channel that I have the link for. About 45 pages of just the ideas of what should this thing look like, and it is a lot of balancing between different extremes. Because on the one hand, there's a lot of churches or Christian groups that would emphasize evangelism to a point of it's just always going out and sharing this gospel message with people, and sometimes the Lord works in that way, and it seems like for some people that God directs them to the people that are going to respond well to that. But, it is just making this, it is just to put it to the point of we have to save people from hell. And then that's the only thing that matters in life. And everything else is just good. You're on your own.
Right.
And then on the other extreme, I would say some of these communities and stuff some of the Amish and the Mennonites and stuff, they obviously have integrated a lot of the community, a lot of the work, but they have no evagelistic emphasis at all. And even I would say, there's many groups that you can look at and you can peg them as that group is stuck in this era of time. And even now I sort of see there's a lot of Christian churches. It's they're kind of stuck in the 80s or the 90s or whatever. And they may not realize it yet, but their culture has become ossified. And we're still close enough to that time where, they're still interacting, but it's just, they're preaching to the choir only,
Right.
And so what I know part of that is that there is a sort of turnover of people at L'Abri. So what's the time span? How's that work for people?
Well, right now it is determined by the Schengen zone, and the Schengen zone in Europe will only allow you to spend. There's, 10, 15 countries in the Schengen zone. I don't have the exact number memorized. But, France, Germany, Switzerland, which is not part of the EU, but is part of the Schengen zone, Italy, Spain, whatnot, all of these countries are part of the Schengen zone. And what they will only allow you to spend 3 months in the entirety, including all the countries together. It used to be you could spend 3 months in Germany, another 3 months in France, another 3 months in Switzerland. So that puts a restriction. Now, if a person gets to a point where it's obvious that they need to stay longer, L'Abri will find a way to call them a worker, to deal with their visas, call them a helper. They don't use the phrase worker until you're actually getting paid there. Call them a helper, give them a slightly different title and find a way for them to stay. So, but yes, that has always been a problem. Like I said, I was there 11 months, and the last, 5-6 months, I was just walking on the trails in the back, and just trying not to look the gendarmes, the police in the face when I have to pass them, so they wouldn't say, "How long has that guy been here?" Because I was clearly there longer than I was supposed to be. But I also wasn't part of L'Abri at that point either, because I wasn't at that time. There were so many people applying to be helpers and whatnot. There were 100 people, around 100 people at a time there, or more, which I think when I talked to Ellis about this, I think eventually if there's a criticism of that time, is that it was too big. And but here's something I was just thinking: if you have practical, what about dinners? What about living together under such and such situation? Any practical questions related to your thoughts, because obviously you spent a while thinking about this. Go ahead and ask me, because the more practical, the more specific you get, the more you'll get out of me.
Sure. Well, I mean, honestly, a lot of that stuff I had thought about, because I've worked at several kind of programs similar to this. So, like at one point, I or more or less right after high school, or a year after, I went to a discipleship program, like a big mega church. And they actually had they had dorms there that were like condos. So that was kind of an interesting thing. There's like 5 guys in a building. Right. You get enough of that personal interaction, some friction to learn some things about living with others. But, there was enough separation, so you didn't have that kind of everybody under one roof thing. Mm-hmm. I've been in other situations where, living with a family in a church, which I think that's a really good thing for, I'm saying, I want to make it, I would like to be providing resources, and hopefully people in different local churches or towns or whatever would think of these different options and do what works best for them. Because I think, I have this idea, I know I can only take it so far. I do have an iteration of it that I plan to, in the next year or so. It might be, if somebody came from out of town, it probably would be find a family in the church that could host them for the period of time. And then I would work with them and teach them things. But I could also see someday, it would be really cool, land is cheap here, buy a big place, have some, have a farm and a big warehouse with all the different, trade setups to really, a full blown trade school. That would be pretty awesome. But I so the other thing I wanted to talk about, because I had read this book, Rookmacher.
All right, Art needs no justification.
Yeah, little skinny book, but I mean he packs a ton of stuff in there, and I think that you've talked about how he obviously had a profound influence on Francis Schaeffer and the L'Abri thing, and of course he's kind of there's some of the Dutch philosophers that are that he's bringing into that equation, what did he bring that was missing from all these other things? Because it's interesting, because I see a lot of like I would say, for instance, the Calvinist part, I think is important because it kind of like keeps you from worrying all the time about like, am I saved and does God love me and do I have to go? Like it can kind of push all that. Like if that's your theology, then you're not going to have the group that's just going out with tracts every day. You can actually accomplish something else in the world.
Right.
And so I see that, and that's like, there's a lot of like talk about like Christian nationalism and some of this stuff, but I see in most of those other groups, although they have the similar theology, they don't know what to do with things like the arts.
Right. Right. Well, it's not just the Calvinists, because obviously the Presbyterians were originally Calvinists. They're different Reformed churches. It was particularly the Dutch.
Yeah.
And it was particularly coming out of Abraham Kuyper, and it eventually moved into people like Rookmaker and Dooyeweerd. And I think one of the reasons why Dooyeweerd struck me so clearly was because by the time I heard his lectures, and I do have lots more to edit and put on there, it's time consuming to get all the images when it needs it. Mm-hmm. I am going to put one on that doesn't have so many images because it doesn't need it. But I think what struck me about Rookmaker is that on one level, he's explaining how we ended up in the situation we are. And he does a very good job of explaining how the Christians retreated from culture.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, he's very practical minded. And you can hear this more in his questions and answers. And he'll take pretty much any question. And someone will say, like, well, what do you think we should do with our hymn books? And he didn't have an answer. I have an answer now. I've been thinking about it a long time. What needs to exist, and I'm not going to be the person to make it, but this is what I would encourage, is someone needs to go and get the best music from particularly American, this would be an American hymnal. But a lot of folk hymns, there's black gospel songs, there's, of course, classic church hymns, Lutheran hymns, Wesleyan hymns, and all of this, Catholic hymns. And, like if I was to take the book we were using in the Presbyterian Church in Alaska when I was there for the last 5-6 years, we had a new book, I would cut out probably something radical out of it. Like I would leave maybe about 50 pages. 50 to 75 pages out of 300, mm-hmm. and get rid of all the rest. And then I know enough about the other kinds of music we have to know, okay, we got to get the shape note songs in there. We have to get this. There needs to be one hymn book which you can pick up safely and say, these are all good songs. And that's what's missing is now, I don't know what happens when you start adding hill songs to the church hymnals and stuff like that. There's already a lot of small praise songs and almost anything written since the 70s is largely problematic on a doctrinal and emotional level, just because that's what's been happening, this kind of commercial romanticism. So somebody needs to go and dig out all this great music and put it into one hymn book. And it needs to be a hymn book that really puts an emphasis on the best music and the best words. And there's so many great songs that you will not find in most hymn books. And I've run into so many. I keep getting CDs of old American songs and listening to them all the time. I go like, oh, there's another one. Oh, there's another one. I've found maybe 200 songs that nobody hardly ever sings. And the minute you start singing them, you're saying like, oh, this gets you in the right way. This really makes you feel like you want to live in the world, you want to show love, but also have courage to not surrender to the whims of the day and stuff like this. Whereas a lot of the newer music tends to just be a sidebar on the music that's going around in the world. There's a lot of connections, but I'm not going to go into music too much more right now. But the thing is, Rookmacher would deal with that. He would talk about, okay, we do have a problem with our hymn books. Somebody has to work on this. He says, I'm not the person, but somebody has to work on this. And so far, no one has.
Mm-hmm.
They've done so in a very commercial way. One of the things I really don't like about the hymn book we were using is when you get to the last 40 pages or so, it's all copyrights. It's all someone saying, I'm making money on this. Where, why should people be making money on hymns, particularly if you have good old hymns? And so what they would do even is make new arrangements of them and copyright the arrangements. And I'm tearing my hair out over stuff like that. I said, you can sell your Christian album, or you can do this and try to make money as a Christian entertainer or whatever, but don't do it in the hymn book. This is for church. This shouldn't have anything connected with it, or very little. So.
Yeah. Well, I did think about. I want to talk about music at some point, because that is one of the. I've been playing guitar since I was 12, and and that kind of it kind of affects like my thoughts about things. Like I do love a lot of the old hymns. I grew up as a kid singing those and stuff. But anytime like somebody makes a categorization of like these are the sanctified instruments and these are the worldly instruments, I'm like, well,
yeah.
I'm like, well, I want to go to the church where I get to play guitar because, I like doing that.
Well, here's the thing: don't you want to go to the church where they play good music? And I'm going to do a video at some point about what actually makes music bad, because I think most people do not have an understanding of the difference between good music and bad music. And so many Christians will simply say, well, as long as everyone's participating. But it's the idea that as long as we're inclusive enough, God will be happy. Where my feeling is no, and it's interesting in the churches here, they don't have that idea at all. Here the idea is we give our best to God, and you don't give your broken little thing to God. If that was your best, I suppose you would give that. But the point is, most people can make much better than we often give. And so, for instance, you don't even hear that much congregational singing here. Mm-hmm. What you hear instead is choirs of maybe 4 to 8 people singing these absolutely haunting, beautiful harmonies. And I find that I'm saying like, okay, maybe they're being a bit too strict, but I would rather err on the side of the mystery and holiness of God than I would err on the side of anybody can say anything they want. Anyone can that is to say, and then you let in people who are saying things that after a while are leaving the province of Scripture and the church altogether. So, it's the difference between, I've been part of a church where it was all about the Holy Spirit leading you. And the problem is there's almost this idea that the Bible doesn't mean anything unless the Spirit is reading it through you, mm-hmm. which there's truth to that. However, after a while, what becomes more important is the truth in you rather than the words. So you start with a couple of words, and then after a while, you've spun out some sort of fantasy into, and I think the furthest of they're almost antinomian churches, some of the Pentecostal churches and stuff that are way down at the end who want no authority whatsoever within the church except coming directly from God, which in my mind is a very romantic notion, because what you're saying is that you're going to hear the absolutely best message, which I know from my own life. It's like, no, I don't hear it.
Yeah.
I've had moments where maybe I've heard something, and other moments where I go like, I shouldn't have said that. That was wrong.
Well, yeah, I spent a long time in.
Which is another aspect of community. How do you deal with people who have heterodox ideas? See, it's one thing for us in the little corner to have Sam on, and Sam is not a Trinitarian. It's another thing to have Sam in your church. Now, my feeling is, if Sam wants to come, let him come. Let him raise questions. But too many churches don't like questions.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think, it's interesting because, even within Protestantism, where you say the Bible is the final authority, but if your particular church also has a creed that it subscribes to, you're not going to be overturning that creed within the local church. And so if it has, particular
Well,
things,
that is, and I learned that the hard way in our church, because what happened was we had these problems on the communes with people. Like there was a guy who went around and slashed all the tires because he got mad, and he was a former convict at San Quentin, so this was not lightweight, just a juvenile delinquent kind of person. This was a guy in his 40s at the time, while we were all in our 20s or younger. And he got mad because he couldn't drink and do drugs and stuff. And so to get even with us, he went around, slashed, I think, the tires on about 10 cars, unplugged a large freezer we had full of a lot of pork and other meat that we'd had from our animals. And it all rotted, and we didn't realize it was going on. And so in order to combat that, we then started coming up with more rules. So we went from being much looser about things to suddenly tightening up, but the tightening up became the problem.
Yeah.
And eventually we started doing very cult-like things.
Well, I think there's always a temptation to create a rule and then want to just then think it's settled, and then you are going to follow that rule, to its fullest logical conclusions.
Right.
Not seeing that it probably will cause other problems.
Well, I think there needs to be some new rules. For instance, should smartphones be allowed in church? Now, I know many Americans would say, well, of course you have to. But why? Are you expecting someone to die soon or to get a report from the hospital? And of course, our answer is often to turn it down and put it in airplane mode or whatever, just so that it doesn't disrupt people. But, how many times have I seen a teenager in church sitting there just staring at their phone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's an issue there that many churches don't have an answer for. You don't see that as much of a problem here because of the nature of Orthodox worship. And for one thing, it doesn't involve sitting. Unless you're very old, you can sit in the back or something. But basically, people are standing for a couple of hours. And secondly, you're not supposed to be looking at your phone all the time. And there are little signs saying not to bring phones into church. Part of that is so that the services aren't disrupted by tourists and things like that. But these are problems. New problems develop all the time. And we don't have answers for them all because many times, that's why I've just, in the last few months, started using a smartphone. So I'm just now figuring out, okay, what have I watched since, say, 2005 with the smartphones coming in? What are the things that absolutely annoy me about them? What are the things that I don't want to continue? And I say, so what should or shouldn't happen on here for me to start with? Because I want to live in a certain way in the real world. I don't want to be, so for one thing, I always take a book with me. So that's my, if I'm going to go into a default position, it's going to be to sit and read. I have a rule. I'm not watching videos on YouTube while I'm traveling, unless it's something, I have to check. So someone said, Byrne, your video is wrong, and I have to look at it for a moment. But apart from that kind of thing, no. And I'm sure if there was some great emergency, I would be watching a video. But basically, no videos, no responding on Twitter, YouTube, other platforms, with one exception, and that exception is Facebook. if this was Alaska, Facebook would be a part of the things I wouldn't respond to either. But in Georgia, people use Facebook seriously. I'm always getting my connections through the messenger on Facebook, and so I have to keep it active. But I haven't started getting notifications from it yet. So, and then I get text messages. So those two items are the things I need most. I can wait to respond or read Twitter. I can wait. There's nothing anybody is possibly going to say to me on YouTube or Twitter that needs me to address it immediately wherever I am. I can always wait. I can wait a day or two. So I've kind of got this mentality because I've watched. The thing I dislike most is when I'm in a room with people and you hear something go ding, and then they look away. It's like you stopped existing. It's the Pavlovian dog response. But Marshall McLuhan talked about that back in the 60s, where he talks about how we respond to the phone, and we almost can't help it. So we hear that ringing sound of the old phones, and we feel like someone's calling out to me. Well, no one on Twitter, for instance, which I am a part of, is going to call out to me in such a way as, Byrne, if you don't answer this now, it's going to hurt. You're going to be in trouble. Even if there was something I did that was kind of like someone had problems with it, it can all wait. So it's how do you deal with these things, these nuts and bolts kind of things, that I think part of the problem that churches have is they don't think about these things until it's too late. Interestingly, when laptops started to become a thing, and people started to use them wireless and then started to use the internet on them wherever they went, L'Abri realized, okay, we've got a problem here. You can't be here and be trying to learn things and be constantly distracted. So the rule became you leave your laptop at a certain place. You can have it for an hour or two in the evening on 2 or 3 nights a week. I love this. And just as they did this, then the smartphone suddenly took off. So they had to make another policy for that, because these things are the kind of distractions that, we live with these things all the time. But in an environment like L'Abri, where you're there to study. So, are you coming to study, or are you coming to simply live in the same world you've been living in? Because that's what the phone represents. It represents that wherever I go, I'm in the same place. So, and those are serious community issues. Yeah,
and I think, obviously, the best solution is not to simply just squash every new problem as it arises. No. You have to. I mean, the better way would be to fill your life with positive things that give it meaning and purpose to the extent you know what you're supposed to be doing,
And realize how hard that is to do. Because the difficult thing is that we are constantly distracted in this world. The world we live in is one constant distraction. So whether it's the news and the events of the day, or whether it's entertainment, or whether it's information, it's so easy to be distracted by it all. And we have to admit we are indeed distractible. So, and give ourselves grace. But the problem is it's way too easy to give ourselves way too much grace. And then after a while, it's all streaming all the time.
Right. Well, and so
you can't do that because you have a child, right? Yeah. So and you have work to do, and so you are reminded by your daily situation, like, I gotta keep my mind focused. But a lot of people, the kind of people who are in dorm room situations and stuff where people form a lot of their habits, don't have any of those things to prevent them from slipping off into the virtual.
Yeah, and this is my big impulse behind it. I think because I realized that my own spiritual health and well-being, and just as a person as well, is tied into like the actual physical work that I'm doing.
Mhm.
And a lot of it is creative. One of the things I really liked about Rookmacher's book is he kind of talked about, and this is I think there's a little disconnect, but it made more sense. The last time we talked after reading this book, I'm like, oh, okay, now I have more of the vocabulary to discuss it, because he talks about how at a certain point, art or artisanship, craftsmanship, it was all kind of one thing. And then at a certain point, it gets split off where you have painting, sculpture, maybe like classical music or the highest, most intellectually superior branches of these things. And then everything else is lesser.
Right.
Where now realizing that's not the way it is. And that in a sense, like a lot of the work I do, it is a very creative, artistic process. A lot of times I'm fixing things. I'm fixing things on people's kitchen cabinets. The goal of it is that you do not notice what I did, because if there's a blemish or a mark or something, so it's an artistic endeavor that leaves no.
Well, interestingly enough, in the very Christian late Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky's book Sculpting in Time, which I recommend after watching a couple of his films. He talks about what is art. He says one of the things art has to be is it has to, in a sense, create a frame around itself. And it also has to not leave evidence that it is art. In a sense, it's providing something. It's not about saying, I'm dipping chocolate in, I'm dipping, pieces of bronze into chocolate and hanging it from the ceiling. Ooh, and someone goes, oh, that's art. No, it's not that. It's creating something, and you're looking at it for the holes in it because you're trying to fill up the holes. I don't know if you saw that weird video I just did about my room.
Repeated it. Yes.
But the whole time I'm looking at the room, I'm looking at the hole for the holes. I'm looking at for when it breaks down and no longer seems like what I'm doing. And because I think that's art. And it's the same if you're building a house. It's the same if you're making clothing. It's the same if you're out in your field planting a garden. You're looking for the holes that need to be filled. For instance, you want to get as many vegetables growing as possible. And then you would notice, this one here didn't make it. Now, if it's too late in the season, you can't do anything about it. But if it's early in the season, you say, I'll plant something else there. And in the sense, Ellis has this idea that everything we do is an art. I don't know if you heard him talking about it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I completely agree with him, but that's the wonderful thing about life. We can have different ideas and say, well, he thinks that and I think this. So, but at the same time, I think that there are things that are, there are different kinds of art and everything, but everything I think should fit into, I made a triangle out of my understanding of Rookmacher's ideas so that the top part is the meaning of a thing. And one corner is the function or the place that the thing fits. And the other corner is the way it interacts in as communication or something like that. Then what happens is eventually the meaning becomes the artistry or the art of the piece, not the artist, but it becomes, eventually this breaks off entirely and starts to become its own world. Likewise, as that happens, then the other two parts start to drift because this is no longer being held together. I need to make a video where I just really explain this all by itself. Then what happens is the function part starts to disappear. So in music or painting today, you can see that our public music has been reduced to recordings. Our recordings have become just strange. You walk into a coffee shop and who knows what they're playing. And it's loud. And yet the coffee shop would not feel good to itself without it. They don't trust people just talking. And there are many environments where people don't know what to do if they're just sitting and there's not music, just some kind of weird music. It doesn't matter what it is, just something filling the noise. So we've created this new sense of function. And then on the other side, the only thing that seems to connect to people as something artistic, or not artistic, something entertaining, there's the word. So the communication ends up being all entertainment. And the way I say, so there's another variation on this for the commercial world, which is essentially what took over from all attempts to dethrone it. And it started to imitate everything. And so just as, for instance, today we have imitation wood, we also have imitation hamburgers and imitation music. You know, they all function as wood, as food, as music. But the more you listen to them, you realize that isn't that electro beat I hear in the background. I hear this all the time here. I'm sitting there saying, like I'm in a mall and I can just hear doo, 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 doo. It doesn't matter what the song is. They all have the same kind of rhythm. And I'm saying to myself, okay, so we've just turned this into a little machine we turn on and walk away from. It fills in that sound so we don't have to wonder what life is about. That's entertainment. Entertainment actually means you have two poles and you run a rope or a string across them. Entertainment is the tension between the two poles. That was what the word originally meant. So it's the thing that keeps us dancing on top of reality, the dark pole and light pole of reality. But you can see it with food. You know, we get something that's fast and cheap to eat. And I take part in that just like anybody else. It's not that I'm saying that's evil, although there are certainly evil aspects to it. But the point is that we live in a world where it's really hard for people to stop and cook. So it's another thing. And the fake wood. I mean, there's a huge place here called Saba, and it's a 3-story like huge warehouse that has all these people who are vendors in there trying to sell you furniture and things related to household stuff. And I'm walking through there, looking for things that are real wood. And I bought a few things and then realized later, oh, I missed it. This wasn't real. It looked real until I scratched it, and it doesn't. You know, we know what wood looks like when you scratch it. It kind of gets an indentation in it and you see more wood. Well, when you scratch some of this faux wood, it looks kind of white. It's something that was molded and shaped into wood. So for my money, I'd much rather get something that's cheap, not cheap, but just a simple thing that doesn't have all the extras, but I know it's made out of wood. And yeah, it's complicated. I mean, it's all very complicated. The world we live in, how do we work within it? I don't have an answer. I just know what I do. And like I say, okay, so I find out that I have this one table set that has like a faux wood. Do I get rid of it? No. I just, okay, all right, they got me on that one. And someone was getting rid of some shelves. I always need shelves. And I could tell they were just made out of some pressed muck. But I said, okay, well, let's deal with it. So I just repainted them and made them look very different because there's no point in throwing away material if you can make it work. So there's a place for being thrifty, but maybe changing the meaning of it. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I've thought about this, like the things you said about texture really resonated with me because I noticed that a lot because even before I had seen any of your stuff, I'd been making furniture for a long time. And a lot of it out of like reclaimed material sometimes, which has a beautiful texture. But sometimes I would use stuff I buy at the store. And the best way I found to, because sometimes you'll see people like they'll have their little cottage craft and they're making like little carts for to go next to grills or something, and it's made out of like 2x4s screwed together, and it's like, okay, that's fine, like that's a useful thing, but there's no like craft to it because it was just assembled cheaply.
Right.
It's a real thing because it's made out of real wood, but I found that it's the changing the texture, changing the dimension from slightly different to that standard 1.5 inch thickness, getting rid of those rounded edges. Then you can take construction lumber and actually make something that it is real because it's made out of real wood, but it looks like something
here's the thing,
that a human touch.
You notice that because you deal with real wood.
Yeah.
Now, I'm no shelf maker, but I have to make shelves.
Yeah.
And I've come up with a simplistic design, which you'd never want to sell these in a store, but nevertheless, they accomplish their goal. And part of the reason they do is because I have thought a lot about how to present these. And so for one thing, they're originally made out of pine, but they don't look like it anymore. They look, if you look over there, over there.
Let's see.
If you look over there, you will see that they're very dark and they're very tall. When people come in, their general feeling is like, whoa. And yet what they're looking at is not fine craftsmanship. But what they are looking at is, I have put a lot of thought into them.
Yeah.
And that thought tends to resonate from them. I think anybody who actually knows anything about wood would say, okay, he did that and that was cheap, and that was a shortcut, and I wouldn't have done that because I'm not skilled with those things, but I'm just skilled enough to fake it. So,
well, the interesting thing I think is, like, if I go to like fine woodworking, the magazine or whatever, or something. Right. And what they're presenting is, like, it is very elevated. A lot of times it still has a really good quality because some of those things have design elements that aren't so typical. Right. But like the pinnacle of woodworking that a great woodworker would notice is not going to be impressive to most people because essentially it looks machine made, or it's and like, because when you were dealing with nature to get something to a place of perfect smoothness, square edges, straight and true and everything, that was the difficult task.
Right.
Whereas now it's like nobody's impressed with that because it just looks like a thing you bought. And so, like, let's see, you see, okay, so like this thing here.
There's a lot of themes there.
Yeah. So like it was just a board, it's a cedar beam, and I just I took a hand plane with a curve on the blade. I ground a curve on the blade and I go across it real rough in one direction and then in the other, and then I spray it with a little bit of a brown lacquer and then sand it. So then you have the low spots are dark and the high spots are a little lighter, and it has a texture to it. And it's just like, it's more rustic. It's not the fine quality, but I think to me it's way more appealing. I think to a lot of people too, because it's evidence of humanity, being there.
Exactly.
I mean, so, and I think, that's kind of part of the solution is people need to learn how to do things, because even, like, and I've noticed this many times, if you go over somebody's house and they, and maybe as a hobbyist or whatever, have built something or fixed something in their home or whatever, this is the difference between a professional woodworker and an amateur woodworker. If you go to an amateur woodworker and you compliment them on what they've done, they'll say, "Oh yeah, well, I see I messed up here, and I meant to do this and another thing." And the professional, when you point out something that they've done, you just say, "Thank you." The mistakes are still there. It's just you don't.
Yeah. I understand the idea.
But even in that like the like the sense of pride that people get even from stuff, I'm like, well, it's not that great. Like I honestly, I'm not a snob about this stuff because I understand, like, it's special because you made it. Like, and
when I get my reward is when people walk into the room and you can just tell on their face they're going, I've never seen anything like this, and this is wild. This is great. When they do that, that's all I need. They don't have to say anything after that because I've already done what I wanted to do, and that is to give them a sense that the world doesn't have to be a lot of white walls and sterile stuff. Yeah. You can transform stuff, and it doesn't cost that much money to do. But yeah. So I am going to have to go here in a few minutes. So, but we should have another conversation. Write a list or something for the next time, and ask about certain aspects of community, and it can be anything from cooking to people getting along at work, or because the more specific questions you ask, the more I can give you. Believe me.
Okay.
Because all of those, I've got plenty to say. But if you ask me about, what about community, which is fine, got to start somewhere. But if you just ask me that, then I'll give you the general. But I think trying to do something with community, the devil is in the details. So you can say, yes, we need community. We need to get together. But without thinking of the really practical details, like I said, one practical detail is do not put two families under the same roof. Yeah. It's just, you're asking for trouble. But, there are other things. How do you cook? How do you cook together? Do you always cook together? The formal meals at L'Abri were a really fascinating idea that I really like. I've never been able to exactly replicate them, but I have given it a try. And try different sorts of things because I realize one of the things people need to do is to talk and not just banter at dinner. There needs to be dinners where we talk about things, because that's one of the best parts about eating is being able to talk. Yeah. So there's all these things. So ask details about stuff and I'll give you detailed answers. Okay. And we'll take this one and the other one is given. And we'll go from there.
Okay. All right. That sounds good. So
I appreciate your inviting me on. And like I say, I'll take this in a couple months or whatever and use it on my own channel.
All right. That sounds like a plan.
I think we had a pretty good discussion.
So there you have it. I thought that was a pretty fascinating conversation. I hope you did too. There are other Anadromous dialogues on my channel. There's a whole playlist for them. And a lot of interesting people. I will have Ellis Potter back on again relatively soon, and a lot of people seem to like him. He has a unique perspective on the world, but there will be other people as well. Yes, indeed, the cute and the creepy is coming. Are you ready? Because all I can say is when I finally get my history of it, some things are going to be said there that are going to make you go, whoa! How was that? Was that nice? Wow! Well, from Tbilisi, Georgia, this is Byrne saying, Drobit. We will meet again.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
It's like a stampede. They love that music. Play it again for them, so I'll give them another tune.